The February night air in Nashville carried that distinct chill that reminded locals winter hadn't quite loosened its grip on Tennessee. Broadway Street pulsed with its usual energy. Neon signs flickering against brick facades, the muffled thump of bass lines bleeding through honky-tonk doors, and tourists weaving between locals who moved with the purposeful stride of people who belonged. The Bluebird Lounge, tucked on a quieter corner 3 blocks from the main drag, wasn't one of those tourist traps. It was a genuine piece of Nashville history, a venue where legends had played before they were legends, where the wood-paneled walls had absorbed decades of stories, heartbreak, and triumph. Tonight, it hosted the annual Music City Gives Back charity event, a fundraiser for the Nashville Music Education Foundation that drew an eclectic mix of industry insiders, musicians, and wealthy donors. Richard Caldwell stepped out of his black Mercedes S-Class, the door held open by his driver, Jerome Patterson. At 52, Richard embodied a particular brand of Texas wealth. Expensive suit, tailored in Dallas, Rolex Daytona on his wrist, hair graying at the temples in that distinguished way money seemed to perfect. His chain of luxury car dealerships across Texas had made him incredibly wealthy, and he wore that wealth like armor. 2 hours, Jerome. Not a minute more, Richard said, adjusting his cufflinks. This Nashville charity circuit nonsense. Jennifer insisted we make an appearance. Jerome nodded professionally, accustomed to his employer's dismissive tone. Yes, sir. I'll be here. Richard's wife, Jennifer Caldwell, emerged from the passenger side in an elegant navy dress, her blonde hair swept up, diamond earrings catching the streetlight. At 48, she maintained the polished appearance expected of a wealthy Texas businessman's wife. Though lately, the effort felt increasingly hollow. Richard, please try to be pleasant tonight, Jennifer said quietly as they approached the entrance. These are good people doing good work. Writing a check is good work, Jennifer. Standing around pretending to enjoy hillbilly music is torture, Richard replied, flashing a practiced smile at the volunteer checking names at the door. Inside, the Bluebird Lounge radiated warmth. String lights draped across the ceiling, round tables filled the main floor, and a small stage sat at the far end, where a rotating lineup of musicians would perform throughout the evening. The crowd was already substantial, maybe 200 people, ranging from young songwriters in their best thrift store finds to industry executives in designer labels. Richard immediately gravitated toward the bar, ordering an expensive bourbon that the bartender, William Davis, had to retrieve from the top shelf. Jennifer drifted toward a group of women discussing the foundation's recent successes in underfunded school districts. $15,000 for a table, and they serve it in a plastic cup, Richard muttered to the man beside him, a music producer named Travis Montgomery, who'd made the mistake of standing too close. Travis forced a polite smile. It's about the cause, not the amenities. If I wanted to drink from plastic, I'd go to a college football game, Richard continued, oblivious to Travis's discomfort. Jennifer dragged me here from Dallas. Do you know how much business I'm missing being in this? What do they call these places? Honky-tonks? This is actually more of a listening room, Travis corrected gently. The Bluebird is famous for… I'm sure it's very quaint, Richard interrupted, scanning the room with barely concealed disdain. The evening progressed with performances from various artists. Richard checked his phone constantly, responded to emails, and made no effort to hide his boredom. Jennifer shot him warning looks across the room, but he ignored them with practiced efficiency. Around 9:30, during a break between performances, Richard headed toward the restrooms located down a narrow hallway lined with framed photographs of legendary performers who'd graced the venue. He was scrolling through his phone, not watching where he was going, when he collided with someone coming from the opposite direction. "Watch it," Richard snapped, looking up. The man he'd bumped into was probably in his early 70s, wearing faded Wrangler jeans, well-worn brown leather boots, a simple button-down shirt, and a tan cowboy hat. He had a weathered face, the kind shaped by years of genuine living, rather than expensive skincare routines, and a quiet presence that suggested comfort in his own skin. "Sorry about that, friend," the man said with a slight Texas drawl, his tone genuinely apologetic, despite Richard being the one who'd walked into him. Richard's eyes traveled from the scuffed boots up to the modest hat, his lip curling slightly. Here, at an event where he'd paid $15,000 for a table, was someone who looked like he'd wandered in from a ranch supply store. "This is a private event," Richard said coldly. "Are you sure you're supposed to be here?" The older man's expression remained neutral, though something flickered in his eyes. Surprise, perhaps, or recognition of what was happening. "I'm where I need to be." Several people in the hallway had noticed the interaction, including a tall man with dark hair and a distinctive face that anyone in the country music world would recognize instantly. Alan Jackson. He'd been talking with two other musicians near the wall of photographs, but had turned at Richard's sharp tone. "Your boots are tracking dirt," Richard continued, his voice rising slightly. "And that hat looks like you found it in a garbage bin. This is a formal charity event, not a rodeo. Who let you in here?" The older man in the cowboy hat said nothing, his jaw tightening slightly, but his eyes remained calm. That restraint somehow made Richard angrier, as if the man's refusal to be provoked was itself an insult. "I'm talking to you," Richard pressed. "Did you sneak in? Are you looking for handouts? Because the charity case is supposed to benefit from the donations, not show up expecting free drinks." Jennifer appeared at the end of the hallway, her face pale. "Richard, what are you doing?" "I'm addressing a security issue," Richard said, not taking his eyes off the man in the cowboy hat. "This person clearly doesn't belong here." Alan Jackson took a step forward, his expression a mixture of disbelief and controlled anger. "Richard, is it? You might want to stop talking right now." Richard finally turned to look at Alan, not recognizing him either, despite his distinctive features and towering height. "And you are. Someone trying to save you from making an even bigger fool of yourself," Alan said evenly. "Fool?" Richard laughed, a harsh sound. "I paid good money to be here tonight. I have every right to question why someone who looks like they shovel horse manure for a living is wandering around unsupervised." The hallway had gone completely silent. At least a dozen people were now watching, some with their phones out, others simply frozen in shock at what they were witnessing. The man in the cowboy hat finally spoke again, his voice quiet but carrying clearly in the hushed space. "I think I'll head back to my table now. Excuse me." He moved to step around Richard, but Richard shifted to block his path, emboldened by what he perceived as weakness. "Not so fast," Richard said. "I'm going to find whoever's in charge here and make sure they know their security is lacking. We have donors here, important people, and you're making everyone uncomfortable with your presentation." "Richard, stop it! Now!" Jennifer's voice was sharp, desperate. She'd pushed through the small crowd and grabbed her husband's arm. "We're leaving. We're not leaving until—" "That's George Strait!" Jennifer hissed, her face flushed with humiliation. "That's George Strait, Richard. The singer. The legend. Oh my God, what have you done?" Richard blinked, looking back at the man in the cowboy hat with confusion. "George? Who?" A woman nearby, dressed in an elegant black pantsuit, let out an audible gasp. "You don't know who George Strait is? Are you serious right now?" The man, George Strait, apparently, gave a slight shake of his head, tipped his hat politely to Jennifer, and walked past Richard without another word. Alan Jackson followed him, shooting Richard a look of pure disgust as he passed. Richard stood in the hallway, still not fully comprehending what had happened. Around him, people were whispering, some loudly expressing shock, others already typing furiously on their phones. "Jennifer, who is George Strait?" Richard demanded, his voice defensive now, sensing the shift in the room but not understanding it. Jennifer closed her eyes, her hand still gripping his arm. "He's only one of the most successful country music artists of all time, Richard. He's sold over 100 million records. He's a Texas legend, for God's sake. He's from Texas, our state. And you just humiliated him and us in front of everyone here." The color drained from Richard's face as the magnitude of his error began to penetrate his arrogant confidence. Through the hallway entrance, he could see George Strait rejoining a table where several other people sat, all of them looking toward the hallway, with expressions ranging from anger to pity. A young woman with red hair, holding up her phone, stepped closer to Richard. "I'm Catherine Morrison with Nashville Scene," she said. "Would you like to comment on what just happened? I got most of it on video." "Video?" Richard's voice cracked slightly. "It's probably already going viral," Catherine said, her tone journalistic but with an edge. "Millionaire businessman mocks Texas legend George Strait at charity event." That's quite a headline. Richard looked at Jennifer, then at the crowd around them, then back toward the main room where George Strait sat calmly at his table, being consoled by friends who were clearly upset on his behalf. For the first time in years, Richard Caldwell felt something unfamiliar creeping up his spine. Genuine fear of consequences. "Jennifer, we need to fix this," he whispered. But as he looked at his wife's face, filled not with supportiveness, but with disappointment and shame, Richard realized that fixing this might not be possible. Not with a checkbook, not with connections, not with any of the tools he'd used to smooth over problems throughout his life. The hallway slowly emptied as people returned to the main room, but the whispers didn't stop. They followed Richard like a shadow as he and Jennifer made their way back to their table, where the other guests, wealthy donors from various parts of the South, suddenly seemed very interested in their drinks and very uninterested in conversation. On stage, the MC, a woman named Diane Fletcher who worked for the foundation, announced the next performance. But before the musician could start, she paused, smiled warmly, and said, "We're incredibly honored tonight to have some true legends in the room. George Strait, thank you for being here and for your continued support of music education. You are the gold standard of grace, talent, and character." The room erupted in applause. George Strait raised his hand in a modest wave, his expression unchanged, neither seeking attention nor shying from the acknowledgement. Richard sat at his table, his expensive bourbon untouched, watching George Strait receive genuine admiration from a room full of people. The man he'd mocked looked more dignified in his simple clothes than Richard felt in his $5,000 suit. Jennifer leaned close to his ear. "We're staying until the end. We're going to applaud every performance. And then you're going to figure out how to apologize to that man. Though I honestly don't know if there are words for what you did." Richard wanted to argue, wanted to defend himself, wanted to explain that he hadn't known, that it was an honest mistake. But as he looked around the room at the faces now turned away from him, at the phones still occasionally pointed in his direction, at his wife's mortified expression, he realized that none of his usual excuses would work here. He'd insulted someone beloved, someone respected, someone who represented values that, despite Richard's wealth and success, he himself had never embodied. And unlike the business deals he'd fumbled or the social missteps he'd made in Dallas high society, this mistake couldn't be bought off or smoothed over with charm. The music started again, filling the Bluebird Lounge with the authentic sound of country storytelling. But Richard Caldwell heard none of it. All he could hear was the echo of his own words, hanging in the air like an indictment, and the quiet dignity of George Strait's response. "I think I'll head back to my table now." Outside, the February night had grown colder, and Jerome Patterson waited by the Mercedes, unaware that his employer's carefully constructed world had just begun to crumble from a single moment of arrogance in a Nashville hallway. Richard and Jennifer didn't speak during the drive back to their hotel, the Grand Hyatt Nashville. Jerome, sensing the tension crackling in the back seat, kept his eyes on the road and the radio off. Only the hum of the engine and the occasional swish of passing cars filled the silence. Jennifer stared out her window at the passing lights of downtown Nashville, her jaw set in a way Richard had learned to recognize over 23 years of marriage. It meant she was working to control her anger, processing what had happened, deciding how to address it. Richard kept replaying the scene in his mind, but from a different angle now. He saw himself blocking George Strait's path, heard his own voice dripping with contempt, remembered the shocked faces of everyone in that hallway. His stomach churned with something he rarely experienced, genuine embarrassment mixed with the creeping realization that he'd revealed something ugly about himself to a room full of strangers. The hotel valet opened Jennifer's door, then Richard's. They walked through the pristine lobby, all modern design and soft lighting, without acknowledging each other. In the elevator, Jennifer finally spoke. "Our daughter is going to be mortified." Richard flinched. Their daughter, Emily Caldwell, was a 26-year-old who'd moved to Austin after college, working for a nonprofit and deliberately choosing a life nothing like her parents' Dallas social circuit. She'd grown increasingly distant over the past few years, and Richard knew why. Even if he refused to fully acknowledge it, she was ashamed of who her father had become. "Emily doesn't need to know about this," Richard said weakly. Jennifer's laugh was bitter. "Richard, that reporter said it was going viral. Emily will probably see it before we wake up tomorrow morning. Everyone will see it." In their suite, Jennifer kicked off her heels and poured herself a glass of wine from the minibar. Richard loosened his tie and reached for his phone, which he'd been avoiding since leaving the Bluebird Lounge. 53 missed calls. Over 200 text messages. His email inbox was exploding with notifications. His hands shook slightly as he opened his text messages. The first was from Lawrence Griffin, his business partner and CFO of Caldwell Luxury Automotive. "Lawrence Griffin, what the hell did you do in Nashville? It's all over Twitter. Call me immediately." Richard's throat went dry. He scrolled through more messages. Several were from friends in Dallas, ranging from concerned to confused to outright critical. 3 were from board members of various charities where Richard served, or had served based on their tone. 1 was from his sister, Patricia Donovan, who lived in Houston. "You finally did it. You showed everyone who you really are. Mom would be horrified." He opened Twitter with trembling fingers. The video was everywhere. Catherine Morrison from Nashville Scene had posted it first, around 10:15 p.m., just over an hour ago. The caption read, "Millionaire businessman Richard Caldwell verbally attacks Texas legend George Strait at Nashville charity event, not knowing who he is. This is heartbreaking to watch. Nashville, editor to George Strait. 2, disgraceful." The video had already been viewed 3 million times. It had been retweeted over 40,000 times. The comments section was a tsunami of outrage. Country Fan 2024. "This is absolutely disgusting. George Strait is a legend and one of the kindest people in the industry. This man should be ashamed." A Texas Proud 88. "How do you live in Texas and not know who George Strait is? And even if you don't know, how do you treat any person like that? Trash." Nashville. Local. "I was there tonight. This video doesn't even show how bad it was." He called George a charity case and accused him of sneaking in. In Nashville, at a music event, the audacity. Music Row Insider. George Strait handled this with pure class. Richard Caldwell showed his true colors. Wealth without character is just expensive ugliness. Richard kept scrolling, each comment landing like a physical blow. The video had been picked up by multiple entertainment news sites. TMZ had already published an article titled, "Texas Millionaire's Epic Fail. Insults George Strait at Charity Event." Country music blogs were running pieces defending George Strait, detailing his legendary status, his humility, his decades of contributions to music and charity. And then Richard found the thread that made his blood run cold. A Twitter user named On Nashville Networks had posted, "Richard Caldwell owns Caldwell Luxury Automotive, multiple dealerships in Texas. Wonder how his business will handle this PR nightmare. I know where I'm not buying my next car." Within that thread, dozens of people were posting reviews on the dealership's Google pages, Facebook, and Yelp. Most were one-star ratings with comments like, "Owner is classist and disrespectful," and "Can't support a business run by someone with such poor character." "Oh, God," Richard whispered. "What?" Jennifer set down her wine glass. Richard showed her the phone. She read in silence, her expression moving from anger to concern. "Richard, this is serious. This isn't just social embarrassment. This could affect the business." Richard's phone rang. "Lawrence Griffin," he answered, putting it on speaker. "Lawrence, do you have any idea what you've done?" Lawrence's voice was tight with fury. "I've been fielding calls for the past hour. Our Facebook page is being bombed with negative reviews. The Houston Chronicle just called me asking for comment. The San Antonio dealership manager said customers are already calling, asking if you're the owner they're seeing on social media. Lawrence, it was a misunderstanding." "A misunderstanding?" Lawrence's voice rose. "You insulted one of the most beloved figures in Texas music at a charity event while being filmed. There's no misunderstanding here, Richard. You showed your ass to the entire country. And now our business is paying the price." Jennifer sat on the edge of the bed, her face in her hands. "What do we do?" Richard asked, hating the weakness in his own voice. "We?" Lawrence's laugh was harsh. "There's no we right now, Richard. You did this. You need to fix it. I'm calling an emergency PR firm first thing tomorrow morning. But honestly, I don't know if this is fixable. You insulted Texas royalty, Richard. George Strait isn't just a singer. He's an institution. This is like insulting Willie Nelson at a barbecue cook-off. It's cultural blasphemy." The call ended abruptly. Richard stood in the middle of the hotel suite, his phone still in his hand, feeling the walls closing in. Jennifer's phone chimed. She looked at it, and her face paled. "It's Emily." She showed Richard the text from their daughter. "Just saw the video. I don't even know what to say to you, Dad. I'm humiliated. Don't call me right now." Richard sank into a chair, the fight draining out of him. "I didn't know who he was, Jennifer. I truly didn't know." "That's not the point." Jennifer's composure finally cracked, her voice sharp and loud. "The point is how you treated him, Richard. Even if he was just a regular person, some random man in jeans and a cowboy hat, the way you spoke to him was cruel and condescending. You judged him based on his appearance. You assumed he didn't belong because he wasn't wearing a suit and Rolex like you. I was protecting the event." "No, you were protecting your sense of superiority," Jennifer interrupted. "You were making sure everyone knew that you're important and wealthy, and that anyone who doesn't look like you must be lesser. And the worst part? I've watched you do this for years. To waiters, to service workers, to anyone you decide isn't worth your basic respect. I've excused it, ignored it, pretended it was just you being particular. But tonight, Richard, tonight the whole world got to see what I've been living with. Richard looked up at his wife, seeing something in her eyes he'd never quite seen before. Not anger, but something closer to resignation, or perhaps liberation. "What are you saying?" he asked quietly. "I'm saying that I'm ashamed to be married to you right now," Jennifer said, her voice breaking. "I'm saying that watching you humiliate a kind, humble man made me realize how much I've compromised my own values to maintain this life. I'm saying that our daughter barely speaks to us because she can't stand what we've become. What you've become." She grabbed her purse and coat. "Where are you going?" Richard stood up, panic creeping into his voice. "I'm getting my own room tonight. I can't look at you right now." Jennifer moved toward the door, then paused. "You need to apologize to George Strait. Publicly. Genuinely. Not because it's good for business, but because it's the right thing to do. And after that, Richard, you need to take a long, hard look at who you've become. Because the man I married 23 years ago would have never done what you did tonight." The door closed with a soft click that sounded, to Richard, like thunder. He was alone. Richard walked to the window, looking out over Nashville's glittering skyline. Somewhere out there, George Strait was probably back home or at his hotel, surrounded by people who loved and respected him, likely unbothered by the incident because he'd experienced it with such grace and dignity. And here was Richard Caldwell, standing in a luxury hotel suite, watching his reputation, his business, possibly his marriage, all beginning to unravel because he'd been too arrogant to recognize value that didn't present itself in expensive packaging. His phone continued to buzz throughout the night. More messages, more calls, more notifications of shares and comments and articles. Around 2 in the morning, Richard saw that Nashville Scene had published a full article on the incident, complete with interviews from people who'd witnessed it. Alan Jackson had provided a quote, "George Strait is one of the finest men I've ever known. Watching him be treated with such disrespect by someone who clearly values wealth over character was difficult to witness. George handled it with his typical grace, but that doesn't make what happened acceptable. We should all aspire to treat people with the kindness and humility that George shows every day." The article also included background on Richard's business, his net worth, his reputation in Dallas circles, but it focused primarily on George Strait's legendary career, his charitable work, his reputation for being one of the most down-to-earth stars in country music, despite his massive success. The contrast was devastating. Richard didn't sleep that night. He sat in the chair by the window, watching the sky slowly lighten from black to deep blue to the pale gray of dawn, thinking about the man in the cowboy hat he'd called a charity case. George Strait had sold over 100 million records. He'd had 60 #1 hits, more than any other artist in any genre. He'd been inducted into the Country Music Hall of Fame. He'd won countless awards. He'd filled stadiums for decades. And he'd done it all while maintaining a reputation for being humble, kind, and genuine. And Richard, with all his wealth and success in the car business, had looked at this legend and seen only scuffed boots and faded jeans. As the sun rose over Nashville on that February morning, Richard Caldwell began to understand something that would take the coming days and weeks to fully absorb. He'd revealed himself to the world, and what the world saw was something he could no longer deny or excuse. The question now was whether he had the courage to truly change, or if this would simply become another story he'd eventually find a way to rationalize, another moment of ugliness he'd blame on circumstance rather than character. Outside, Nashville was waking up. Music City, home of dreamers and legends, was starting another day. And somewhere in that city, George Strait was likely going about his morning with the same quiet dignity he'd shown the night before, while Richard Caldwell sat in his hotel room, surrounded by the wreckage of his own making, finally beginning to feel the weight of consequences that money couldn't buy off. The morning brought no mercy. Richard had finally dozed off around 6 a.m., slumped in the chair by the window, his phone dead in his lap from hours of scrolling through increasingly harsh coverage. He woke to insistent knocking at the suite door at 8:30, disoriented and stiff. It was Jennifer, still wearing last night's dress, her eyes red-rimmed but her expression composed. Behind her stood a professionally dressed woman in her mid-40s, carrying a leather portfolio. "This is Natalie Brennan," Jennifer said curtly, walking past Richard into the suite. "She's a crisis management specialist from Chicago. Lawrence hired her firm overnight. She flew in this morning." Natalie Brennan extended her hand, her grip firm. "Mr. Caldwell, we need to talk immediately. The situation has escalated." Richard, still foggy from lack of sleep, gestured them toward the sitting area. "Escalated? How?" Natalie opened her portfolio, pulling out printed pages. "In the past 10 hours, the video has been viewed over 8 million times across platforms. It's been covered by every major entertainment outlet, 3 major news networks, and has trended on Twitter worldwide. Your businesses have received over 4,000 negative reviews. 6 of your charity board positions have already requested your resignation. And 3 of your major dealership partners have contacted your CFO expressing concern about brand association." Richard's stomach dropped. Brand association? Mercedes-Benz, Lexus, and Porsche all have clauses in their dealership agreements about brand reputation, Natalie explained. "They're concerned that your personal conduct reflects poorly on their luxury brands. They haven't made any decisions yet, but they're monitoring the situation closely." Jennifer closed her eyes, leaning back against the couch. Richard felt like the floor was tilting beneath him. "What do I do?" Richard asked, his voice hoarse. Natalie's expression was all business. "First, you need to understand the landscape. This isn't just about a rude comment at a party. You insulted someone who represents something deeply important to a large demographic, particularly Texans, country music fans, and people who value authenticity and humility. George Strait is beloved not just for his music, but for who he is as a person. Attacking him while he was attending a charity event hits multiple cultural nerves simultaneously." She pulled out another page showing him social media analytics. "The demographic most engaged with this story includes your core customer base, middle to upper-class Texans aged 35 to 65. You've essentially alienated your own market." Richard ran his hands through his hair. "I need to apologize." "Yes, but it needs to be genuine," Natalie said firmly. "The public has a finely tuned sense for empty PR apologies. If you issue a standard 'I'm sorry if anyone was offended' statement, it will make things worse. You need to take full responsibility, acknowledge specifically what you did wrong, and explain, truthfully, what you're doing to address the character flaws that led to this behavior." "Character flaws?" Richard bristled instinctively. "Richard?" Jennifer's voice was quiet but steel-edged. "If you can't even admit to a PR specialist that you have character flaws after what happened last night, then there's no hope for you. Or us." The threat was implicit but clear. Richard swallowed hard and nodded. Natalie continued. "I need to know, do you actually understand why what you did was wrong? Not just that it's bad for business, but why it was morally wrong?" Richard opened his mouth, then closed it. He thought about the question. Really thought about it, perhaps for the first time since the incident. I judged someone based on how they looked, he said slowly. I assumed he didn't belong at an event because he wasn't dressed like me, like the wealthy donors. I treated him like he was less than, like he was a problem to be dealt with, rather than a person deserving of respect. And, Natalie prompted, and even if he hadn't been George Strait, even if he'd been exactly what I assumed, someone who wandered in off the street, I had no right to speak to him that way. No right to humiliate him in front of people. No right to decide his worth based on his boots and jeans. Jennifer looked at him, surprised. Natalie nodded slowly. That's the starting point, Natalie said. Now, do you actually believe that? Or are you saying what you think I want to hear? Richard felt anger flash through him. How dare she question his sincerity? But then he recognized that anger for what it was, defensiveness, the same reflex that had gotten him into this mess. I don't know, he admitted, the words tasting bitter. I want to believe I understand. But the truth is, I've probably treated dozens of people exactly like that over the years. Waiters, valets, salespeople, anyone I decided wasn't important enough to warrant my full attention or respect. Last night is just the first time I got caught on video. The room was silent for a moment. Jennifer's eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them back. Natalie's expression softened slightly. That's honest. We can work with honest. Here's what needs to happen. You issue a public apology today, one that I'll help you draft. You reach out to George Strait directly and privately, offering a personal apology with no expectation of forgiveness or reconciliation. You step back from your public-facing role at the dealerships temporarily, while Lawrence manages the business crisis. And you commit to genuine personal work, therapy, volunteer work, something tangible that demonstrates you're serious about changing. Therapy? Richard frowned. You have anger issues and a superiority complex, Natalie said bluntly. That's not my opinion. It's what the entire internet diagnosed you with overnight. Whether it's accurate or not, you need to address it visibly and genuinely. Richard wanted to argue, wanted to defend himself, but Jennifer's expression stopped him. She was watching him with an intensity he recognized. This was a test, maybe the final test of their marriage. Okay, he said. I'll do it. Natalie spent the next 3 hours working with Richard on a written statement. She rejected his first 4 drafts as too defensive, too vague, too corporate. Finally, with Jennifer's input, they crafted something that felt genuine. My name is Richard Caldwell, and I owe George Strait and everyone who witnessed my behavior at the Music City Gives Back event a sincere apology. Last night, I insulted a man at a charity event based solely on his appearance. I assumed he didn't belong there because he was wearing jeans and boots instead of a suit. I spoke to him with contempt and condescension, blocking his path and questioning his right to be present. I treated him as less than human because I judged his worth by his clothing rather than his character. That man was George Strait, one of the greatest artists in country music history and a Texas legend. But the truth is, even if he hadn't been George Strait, even if he'd been anyone else, my behavior was inexcusable. No person deserves to be treated the way I treated him. I cannot adequately express how ashamed I am. Watching the video of my own behavior has forced me to confront a painful truth. I have spent years treating people with disrespect when I decided they weren't important or wealthy enough to warrant my courtesy. I have operated from a place of arrogance and entitlement, believing that my financial success gave me the right to look down on others. I was wrong. I am sorry. And I am committed to doing the difficult work of becoming a better person. Not because it's good for my business or reputation, but because the man I revealed myself to be in that hallway is not the man I want to be. To George Strait, you handled my disrespect with grace and dignity that I clearly did not deserve. I am profoundly sorry for my words and actions. I do not expect your forgiveness, but I want you to know that your example of humility and class has taught me more in one night than I learned in years of business success. To everyone else, I understand that apologies are just words. I know I need to demonstrate change through actions over time. I am stepping back from my public role at my businesses while I focus on genuine personal growth, including professional counseling. I am also committing to volunteer work with organizations that serve people from all walks of life, so I can learn to see value and dignity where I previously saw only differences. I have a long way to go, and I know many people will never forgive me. I accept that. All I can do is commit to being better. I'm sorry. Natalie reviewed it one final time and nodded. This is good. It's honest, specific, and commits to concrete actions. I'll coordinate with your team to post it across all platforms simultaneously. But Richard, you need to understand. This is just the beginning. Words won't rebuild your reputation. Only consistent action will. Richard nodded, feeling exhausted but strangely lighter. Admitting his flaws in writing, putting them out for the world to see, felt both terrifying and necessary. At 2 p.m., the statement went live on Richard's social media accounts, was posted to the Caldwell Luxury Automotive website, and was sent to major media outlets. The response was mixed. Some people praised the apology for its honesty. Others called it too little, too late. Many remained skeptical, waiting to see if actions would follow words. But the vitriol decreased slightly, replaced by cautious observation. At 4 p.m., Natalie received a call. She listened, her expression neutral, then hung up and looked at Richard. That was someone from George Strait's management team, she said. George received your statement. He asked them to convey that he appreciates your apology and hopes you're sincere about personal growth. He also said he doesn't want this incident to overshadow the charity event's success or become about him. He's asking the media to focus on the good work the foundation does rather than the controversy. Richard felt emotions surge up unexpectedly. Relief, gratitude, and something else he couldn't quite name. Even after being humiliated, George Strait was trying to redirect attention away from himself and back to the cause. He's a better man than I'll ever be, Richard said quietly. Maybe, Jennifer said, but you can try to be better than you were yesterday. That's all anyone can do. That evening, Richard sat alone in the hotel suite. Jennifer had kept her separate room and made 2 phone calls. The first was to his daughter, Emily. She didn't answer, but he left a voicemail. Em, it's Dad. I know you're angry and embarrassed, and you have every right to be. I'm not calling to make excuses. I'm calling to tell you that you were right about me. You've been pulling away for years because you saw something I refused to see. I'm sorry I didn't listen. I'm sorry I didn't change sooner. I'm sorry you have to see your father exposed like this, but I'm grateful because it's finally forcing me to look at myself honestly. I love you. I hope one day you'll let me try to earn back your respect. The second call was to his sister, Patricia. She answered on the 3rd ring. You finally called, Patricia said, her voice flat. I saw your text, Richard replied. You said Mom would be horrified. She would be. You know she would be. She didn't raise us to treat people like that, Richard. When did you become this person? Richard thought about their mother, Dorothy Caldwell, who'd passed away 5 years earlier. She'd been a school teacher in a small Texas town, married to their father, a mechanic. They'd never had much money, but their home had been filled with warmth and dignity. I don't know when it happened, Richard admitted. Maybe it was gradual. Success, money, the Dallas social scene. It all reinforced the idea that I was special, that I'd earned the right to look down on people who hadn't achieved what I had. I forgot where I came from. "Mom used to worry about you," Patricia said softly. "When you first started making money, she was proud. But in her last years, she'd say things like, 'I hope Richard remembers that money doesn't make the man.' She saw it happening, Richard. We all did." Richard felt tears burning in his eyes. "I miss her. I know. So do I. And I think, weirdly, this might be her way of reaching down and smacking you upside the head. She always said everyone gets their reckoning eventually." They talked for another hour, the longest conversation Richard had had with his sister in years. When they finally hung up, Richard felt both worse and better. Worse because he was fully acknowledging years of poor behavior. Better because he was finally being honest. He opened his laptop and began researching therapists in Dallas. He also looked up volunteer organizations in the area, food banks, homeless shelters, after-school programs in underfunded neighborhoods. For the first time in decades, Richard Caldwell was looking at the world not from the top down, but from the ground up. And from that angle, everything looked different. 3 weeks later, Richard stood in the kitchen of the North Dallas Community Hope Center, wearing jeans, a simple t-shirt, and an apron, chopping vegetables for the evening meal service. His hands, more accustomed to signing contracts and shaking hands with luxury car buyers, were clumsy with the knife, and he'd already nicked his thumb twice. Beside him, a woman named Dorothy Washington, a 68-year-old volunteer who'd been working at the center for 15 years, watched his technique with barely concealed amusement. "You're holding that knife like it might bite you, baby," Dorothy said, her voice warm with the particular kindness of someone who'd seen every type of human struggle and maintained her compassion regardless. "Here, let me show you." She guided his hands, demonstrating the proper grip and motion. "Rock the knife, don't hack. Let the blade do the work." Richard tried again, and the carrots fell into more even pieces. "Better?" "Better," Dorothy confirmed. "You're learning. Slow, but learning." Richard had been volunteering at the Hope Center 5 days a week since returning to Dallas from Nashville. The center provided meals, temporary shelter resources, job training, and community support for people experiencing homelessness or economic hardship. On his first day, the director, Michael Harrison, had been skeptical. "I've seen your video," Michael had said bluntly when Richard walked in. "Everyone has. You understand that the people we serve here are exactly the kind of folks you seem to think didn't deserve basic respect." "I know," Richard had replied. "That's why I'm here. I need to learn what I clearly never understood, that every person has dignity and worth regardless of their circumstances." Michael had studied him for a long moment. "Words are easy, Mr. Caldwell. We'll see about your actions. You'll work kitchen duty, cleaning, whatever needs doing. No special treatment, no photo opportunities for your PR campaign. You show up, you work, you listen to people's stories. And if I sense for 1 second that you're here for show rather than genuine growth, I'll ask you to leave." "That's fair," Richard had agreed. Now, 3 weeks in, Richard was still there. He arrived at 4 p.m. each afternoon, worked until the 8 p.m. dinner service ended, then helped with cleanup until 9:30 or 10. His back ached from standing. His hands were dry from washing dishes. His feet hurt in a way they never had before, and something in him was slowly, painfully, beginning to shift. "Mr. Caldwell, we need more bread baskets in the dining room," called Jessica Torres, a young volunteer coordinator with bright purple streaks in her black hair. "On it," Richard replied, carrying the baskets through the swinging door. The dining room was filled with people at long tables. Some were clearly homeless, wearing layers of worn clothing, possessions stuffed in backpacks at their feet. Others looked like they could be anyone. Folks who'd hit hard times, lost jobs, faced medical crises that wiped out savings, families with children, elderly people on fixed incomes, veterans, students. Over the past 3 weeks, Richard had learned their stories. Not all of them. Many people kept to themselves, protecting their privacy in a world that already took too much. But some had opened up during the casual conversations that happened while serving food or cleaning tables. There was Daniel Cooper, a 56-year-old former construction worker whose back injury had cost him his job and, eventually, his apartment. He was sleeping in his truck and trying to save enough for first and last month's rent somewhere. There was Angela Price, a 29-year-old single mother whose abusive ex-husband had left her with nothing but debt and 2 young daughters to feed. She worked 2 jobs but still couldn't make ends meet. There was Raymond Foster, a 72-year-old Air Force veteran whose VA benefits got tangled in bureaucracy, leaving him without his medications for 3 months. He'd lost his small apartment and was staying at a shelter until things got sorted out. Each story was a door opening onto a world Richard had never truly seen. Despite living in the same city all his life, he'd driven past homeless people countless times, barely registering their existence. He'd complained about panhandlers while sitting in his Mercedes. He'd donated to charities like this one without ever considering the actual human beings behind the statistics. Now, as he set fresh bread baskets on tables and made eye contact with the people sitting there, Richard felt the full weight of his previous blindness. "Thank you," an elderly woman said as he placed a basket in front of her. She had kind eyes in a weathered face, and her hands shook slightly as she reached for a roll. "You're welcome, ma'am," Richard replied. Back in the kitchen, he started washing the massive pots used for cooking. Dorothy worked beside him, drying and stacking. "You're different than you were 3 weeks ago," Dorothy observed. "Quieter, more present." Richard scrubbed at a stubborn bit of burned rice. "I'm learning how much I don't know, how much I got wrong." "That's good," Dorothy said. "Not knowing is the beginning of wisdom. It's the folks who think they know everything who stay stuck." Richard had also been attending therapy twice a week with Dr. Helen Vargas, a clinical psychologist who specialized in what she called empathy development and privilege awareness. The sessions were uncomfortable, forcing Richard to examine not just his behavior in Nashville, but patterns he'd developed over decades. "You constructed an identity around being superior," Dr. Vargas had explained in their 4th session. "Success in business became proof that you were better than others, and that belief system required you to constantly identify people who were less than to maintain your sense of superiority. It's a deeply insecure way to live, Mr. Caldwell, constantly needing to put others down to feel elevated yourself." "I never thought of myself as insecure," Richard had protested. "The most arrogant people rarely do," Dr. Vargas had replied gently. "But true confidence doesn't need comparison. True confidence allows you to see others' worth without feeling diminished by it." That concept had been revolutionary for Richard. The idea that recognizing someone else's value didn't decrease his own. It seemed obvious once stated, but he realized he'd spent years operating from a zero-sum mindset where someone else's success, dignity, or worth somehow threatened his. The therapy was ongoing, the volunteer work was ongoing, and the business consequences were still unfolding. Lawrence had managed to stabilize the dealerships through a combination of aggressive customer service initiatives, community outreach, and Richard's complete withdrawal from any public-facing role. Sales had dropped initially, but were starting to recover. The luxury brands were still monitoring, but hadn't pulled their contracts. Richard had resigned from all his charity boards, not because they demanded it, though several had, but because he recognized he'd joined them for status rather than genuine commitment to their causes. He'd written personal checks to each organization, substantial donations with no strings attached and no expectation of recognition. His relationship with Jennifer remained fragile. She was still living separately, though they spoke regularly. Emily had responded to his voicemail with a short text. "I'm glad you're trying, but I need to see consistent change over time, not just immediate reaction to consequences. Let's talk in a few months." It was more than he deserved, and he knew it. One evening in early March, after the dinner service ended, Richard was taking out trash to the dumpster when he encountered a man he hadn't seen before, probably in his early 60s, sitting on the back steps smoking a cigarette. "Evening," the man said, his voice rough but friendly. "Evening," Richard replied, hefting the trash bag into the dumpster. "You're that guy from the video," the man said. It wasn't a question. Richard tensed. "Yeah, I am." The man took a drag on his cigarette, studying Richard through the smoke. "Name's Frank Mitchell. I used to work construction in Houston. Lost everything in a bad divorce and some worse financial decisions. Been on and off the streets for 3 years now." Richard didn't know what to say, so he just nodded. "I seen that video probably 50 times, Frank continued. "Everyone I know seen it. Lot of folks were real angry at you. Said you were proof that rich people are all the same, all looking down on working folks." "They weren't wrong," Richard said quietly. "Maybe," Frank allowed. "But here's the thing that got me thinking. That George Strait, he didn't react like I would've. Hell, he didn't react like most people would've. He just stayed calm, dignified, walked away. That's real strength right there." "He's a better man than I'll ever be," Richard said, echoing the words he'd spoken weeks earlier. "Maybe. Maybe not." Frank stubbed out his cigarette. "What I think is, that whole thing happened to teach something. Not just you, though you clearly needed teaching, but to everyone watching. It's like, here's George Strait, mega famous, mega successful, but still humble enough to wear his old boots and not make a fuss when someone disrespects him. And here's you, rich but not famous, treating him like trash because you couldn't see value unless it was dressed up fancy." Frank stood up, stretching his back. "Thing is, most of us are somewhere in between you two. We got our own prejudices, our own ways of judging folks. The video went viral because people recognized something. Either they've been on the receiving end of that disrespect, or they've done it to someone else. We all got our George Strait moment coming, when someone tests whether we're going to be decent or not." Richard absorbed this, seeing the situation from yet another angle. "What did you think when you saw me working here tonight?" Frank shrugged. "Figured either you're genuinely trying to change, or you're playing a long PR game. Time will tell which one. But I'll say this. You're here, you're working, you ain't making a show of it. That counts for something." He headed toward the door, then paused. "One more thing. George Strait. He's from Texas, right? Grew up in a small town, not wealthy. Worked his way up. He knows both sides. Knows what it's like to be dismissed. And knows what it's like to have success. Maybe that's why he handled your disrespect with grace. He ain't forgotten where he came from." After Frank went inside, Richard stood in the alley behind the community center, the Dallas night air cool against his skin. He thought about Frank's words, about George Strait's roots, about the distance Richard had traveled from his own modest upbringing to the man who'd stood in that Nashville hallway, dripping with contempt for someone in scuffed boots. His phone buzzed. A text from Jennifer. Heard from Emily. "She's willing to have dinner with both of us next month, if you're still doing the work." That's progress. Richard felt hope flutter in his chest. Tentative and fragile. Progress. Not forgiveness. Not restoration. But progress. He texted back, I'll be there. And I'll still be doing the work. It's not temporary, Jen. I can't go back to who I was. Her response took a few minutes. I want to believe that. I'm trying to believe that. Keep showing me. Inside the center, cleanup was finishing up. Dorothy was wiping down tables, humming an old gospel song. Michael was counting supplies for tomorrow. Jessica was coordinating with volunteers about next week's schedule. This was Richard's life now. Not board meetings and luxury dealerships, but community centers and honest work. Not superiority and judgment, but humility and learning. The man who'd insulted George Strait still existed inside him, Richard knew. Those instincts, those patterns, didn't disappear in a month. But he was building something new alongside them, something better, something more aligned with the values his mother had tried to teach him decades ago. As he picked up a broom and started sweeping the dining room floor, Richard Caldwell understood that redemption wasn't a destination you reached. It was a direction you traveled, one humble step at a time, hopefully moving closer to the kind of person who could wear scuffed boots or an expensive suit with equal dignity, because they understood that neither defined a person's worth. He was getting there, slowly, painfully, but genuinely. And for the first time in years, Richard felt like he was building something real. Late April in Texas meant wildflowers blooming along the highways, warming temperatures, and the promise of brutal summer heat just around the corner. Richard drove his personal car, not the Mercedes, but the Toyota Camry he'd bought 2 weeks ago, through the rolling hills southwest of San Antonio, heading toward a small town called Pearsall. Jennifer sat in the passenger seat, the first time they'd spent more than an hour together since Nashville. The silence between them was comfortable now, not charged with tension as it had been. They'd had dinner 3 times in the past month, slowly rebuilding something that resembled their relationship, though both knew it would never return to what it had been. "Are you nervous?" Jennifer asked, as they passed a pasture dotted with cattle. "Terrified," Richard admitted. They were driving to a small music venue where George Strait was performing a private acoustic show for charity. Michael Harrison from the community center had somehow acquired 2 tickets and offered them to Richard with a significant caveat. "If you're going, go to listen and appreciate, not to approach him. The man doesn't owe you a conversation." Richard had accepted the tickets, knowing Michael was right. He wasn't going seeking forgiveness or closure. He was going because someone he'd deeply wronged would be there. And witnessing George Strait's artistry felt like a necessary part of understanding what he'd tried to diminish. The venue, the Cottonwood Barn, was exactly what it sounded like. A renovated barn on the outskirts of Pearsall, holding maybe 200 people maximum. It hosted occasional concerts by both emerging artists and, apparently, legendary ones who wanted intimate settings for special causes. Tonight's show benefited a rural Texas music education program, bringing instruments and instruction to small-town schools that had lost funding for arts programs. Tickets had been expensive, $500 each, with all proceeds going to the cause. Richard and Jennifer arrived an hour early. The parking area was already half full with trucks, sedans, and a few luxury vehicles. Inside, the barn had been transformed into a surprisingly sophisticated space. Exposed wooden beams strung with lights, a small stage at one end, round tables with checkered tablecloths, and a bar serving Texas beer and wine. People were mingling, their conversations creating a warm hum of anticipation. Richard recognized a few faces from the country music industry, musicians he'd now learned to identify through his crash course in the genre over the past months. He also recognized several wealthy-looking couples who were probably donors like himself. Richard Caldwell? He turned to find a man in his early 50s, wearing pressed jeans and a sport coat, extending his hand. "I'm Bradley Peterson. I own several auto dealerships in the Houston area." Richard shook his hand warily, unsure what was coming. "I wanted to say something to you," Bradley continued. "I saw what happened in Nashville. I watched the video, read your apology, followed the news about your volunteer work. Here it comes," Richard thought, bracing for judgment. "It took guts to admit your mistakes so publicly," Bradley said. "And more importantly, it took character to follow through with real change instead of just issuing a statement and moving on. I've been in business 30 years, and I've seen a lot of men in our position, successful, wealthy, completely refuse to acknowledge when they're wrong. You didn't do that. I respect it." Richard was momentarily speechless. "Thank you. That means more than you know." "We've all got our blind spots," Bradley said. "Mine was how I treated my employees for years. Took my son calling me out on it to make me see. Growth is painful, but it's necessary. Anyway, I wanted you to know that not everyone sees you as just the guy from the video anymore. Some of us see you as someone trying to do better." After Bradley moved on, Jennifer squeezed Richard's arm. "See? You're rebuilding. Slowly. But it's happening." They found their table, number 12, near the middle of the room, and settled in. The nerves in Richard's stomach intensified as the 8 p.m. start time approached. At 8:15, the lights dimmed slightly. A woman walked onto the stage, introducing herself as Linda Carmichael, the director of the Rural Music Education Program. She spoke for 5 minutes about the impact of their work, about children in small towns discovering their voices through music, about instruments that would otherwise sit silent, gathering dust now being played with joy and skill. "And now," Linda said, her voice warm with genuine affection, "I have the honor of introducing someone who needs no introduction. But I'm going to give him one anyway, because he deserves it. He's been supporting music education in Texas for decades, long before it was a cause that attracted attention. He's donated instruments, funded programs, visited schools, and inspired countless young musicians simply by being who he is, authentic, humble, and dedicated to his craft. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome George Strait." The applause was thunderous in the relatively small space. George Strait walked onto the stage carrying an acoustic guitar, wearing jeans, boots, a white button-down shirt, and that same tan cowboy hat Richard remembered from Nashville. He looked exactly as he had that night, unpretentious, comfortable, real. "Thank you all for being here," George said into the microphone, his Texas drawl warm and genuine. "This is a cause close to my heart. I grew up in a small Texas town, and music was my way out, my way forward, my way to become who I am. Every kid deserves that chance, whether they grow up to be professional musicians or just someone who finds joy in playing guitar on their porch. So thank you for supporting that." He adjusted his guitar, checked the tuning, and started to play. For the next 90 minutes, Richard sat mesmerized. George Strait performed a mix of his classic hits and deeper album cuts, each song delivered with skill honed over 5 decades of performing. His voice was still strong, still true, carrying emotion and story in every note. Between songs, he shared anecdotes, stories about writing or recording particular songs, memories of his early days playing honky-tonks, reflections on what music had taught him about life. "A lot of folks think success is about getting to the top," George said after finishing Amarillo by Morning. "But I've learned it's about staying grounded when you get there. It's about remembering where you came from and who helped you along the way. It's about treating people with kindness, whether they can do anything for you or not, because that's just being a decent human being." Richard felt those words land in his chest like stones, heavy with truth. The audience was completely engaged, singing along to familiar choruses, listening in reverent silence during quieter moments. This wasn't a stadium show with pyrotechnics and spectacle. It was music stripped to its essence, a man, a guitar, and songs that had become part of the cultural fabric of Texas and beyond. During The Chair, a classic from 1985 about a pickup line in a bar, people laughed at the clever lyrics. During I Cross My Heart, a love song that had become a wedding staple, couples reached for each other's hands. During Troubadour, a reflection on the life of a traveling musician, the room fell into complete silence, everyone absorbed in the story. George Strait wasn't performing, he was communicating, sharing something essential about human experience through melody and verse. When he finished Carrying Your Love With Me, George set his guitar aside and picked up a glass of water. "I want to take a moment to address something," he said, his tone shifting slightly. "A couple months back, something happened at a charity event in Nashville. It got a lot of attention, more attention than I wanted or needed. I don't want to dwell on it, but I do want to say this. We all make mistakes. We all have moments we're not proud of. What matters is what we do after those moments. Do we dig in and defend our worst selves? Or do we have the courage to grow?" Richard's heart was pounding. Around the room, people were glancing at each other, clearly aware of what George was referencing. "I believe in second chances," George continued. "I believe people can change if they're willing to do the hard work. And I believe that music, at its best, reminds us of our shared humanity, that underneath whatever we're wearing or driving or living in, we're all just people trying to make our way through this life with some grace and dignity." He picked up his guitar again. This next song is called I Can Still Make Cheyenne. It's about a rodeo cowboy who's lost sight of what matters and has to decide whether to chase success or return to the person he loves. I think we all face that choice in different ways. Do we chase what looks impressive? Or do we invest in what's actually valuable? As George played that song, Richard felt tears burning in his eyes. Jennifer reached over and took his hand, holding it tightly. The concert ended with All My Exes Live in Texas, an upbeat classic that had everyone singing and clapping. George Strait took his bow, thanked everyone again for supporting music education, and walked off stage to a standing ovation. People began to mingle and make their way to the exits. Richard and Jennifer stood at their table, neither quite ready to leave. "That was incredible," Jennifer said quietly. "He's extraordinary," Richard replied. "Not just talented, but there's a depth there, a groundedness. Everything I'm not. Everything you weren't," Jennifer corrected. "You're different now, Richard. I can see it." Richard was about to respond when he noticed movement near the stage. George Strait had returned, now talking with small groups of people who'd gathered to meet him. He was shaking hands, signing programs, taking photos, all with the same patient grace. "Do you want to try to talk to him?" Jennifer asked. Richard watched for a moment. "Michael said not to approach him, that he doesn't owe me a conversation. Michael's right, but sometimes opportunities present themselves for a reason." Richard considered this, weighing his deep desire to speak with George Strait against his equally deep awareness that he had no right to expect anything from the man. "If I get a chance naturally, I'll take it," Richard decided. "But I'm not forcing anything." They made their way toward the exits, slowly, caught in the flow of the crowd. Richard was almost to the door when he heard a voice behind him. "Mr. Caldwell?" He turned to find Alan Jackson standing there, his distinctive features even more striking in person. The tall singer looked at Richard with an expression that wasn't hostile but wasn't exactly friendly either. "Yes," Richard said, surprised. "I was in Nashville that night," Alan said. "I saw what happened. I remember. You tried to stop me from making a bigger fool of myself." Alan nodded. "George and I have been friends for a long time. Watching you talk to him like that was hard to witness. I wanted to do a lot more than just try to stop you." Richard met his eyes steadily. "I'm sure you did. I deserved worse than I got." Alan studied him for a moment. "I've been following what you've been doing since. The apology, the volunteer work, stepping back from your business. Either you're running the most elaborate PR campaign I've ever seen, or you're actually trying to change." "I'm trying to change," Richard said simply. "Whether I succeed is another question, but I'm trying." "George wanted me to tell you something," Alan said. "He noticed you were here tonight. He said to tell you that showing up took courage, and that he hopes you got something from the music." Richard felt emotions surge up. "He knew I was here?" "George notices everything," Alan replied. "He's just quiet about it. He also said to tell you that he believes in redemption through action. Words matter, but what you do over the long term matters more." "Thank you for telling me that," Richard said, his voice rough. Alan extended his hand. Richard shook it, feeling the firm grip of someone who was offering not friendship exactly, but perhaps respect for the attempt. "Don't waste this chance," Alan said. "A lot of people don't get the opportunity to recognize their mistakes and fix them. You've got that chance. Make it count." As Alan walked away, Jennifer put her arm through Richard's. "Let's go home," she said. They drove back to Dallas in comfortable silence, the Texas landscape rolling past under a sky full of stars. Richard thought about the concert, about George Strait's words and songs, about the grace of being acknowledged without being directly approached. George Strait had known he was there, had sent a message through Alan Jackson, had offered something Richard didn't deserve: encouragement to keep trying. When they reached Dallas, Jennifer surprised Richard by asking him to drive to their house, the home they'd shared for 20 years before she'd moved out after Nashville. "I've been thinking," Jennifer said as they pulled into the driveway. "I've been thinking about whether we have a future together." Richard's chest tightened. "And? I don't know yet," Jennifer said honestly. "But I think I want to find out. Not by rushing back into how things were, but by building something new. Would you want to try marriage counseling? Real counseling, not just smoothing things over?" "Yes," Richard said immediately. "Yes, I would." "Okay, then let's try." She leaned over and kissed his cheek. "You're not the man you were in Nashville, Richard. I can see you working to be someone better. That's worth fighting for." That night, Richard lay in bed in the guest room of his own house. Jennifer wasn't ready for him to move fully back in, and he understood and reflected on the journey of the past 3 months. He'd gone from a millionaire businessman who defined himself by his wealth and status to someone slowly learning that value came from character, not bank accounts. He'd gone from judging people by their appearance to recognizing dignity in every person. He'd gone from treating George Strait with contempt to witnessing the legend perform, and being offered grace he didn't deserve. The road ahead was long. His relationship with Jennifer was fragile. Emily had agreed to regular dinners, but maintained careful boundaries. The business was stable, but his reputation in Dallas social circles was still tarnished. His volunteer work at the community center was ongoing, and probably would be for years. But Richard was learning something essential. Real change wasn't a dramatic transformation that happened overnight. It was a series of small choices, made consistently, that gradually added up to becoming a different person. He'd never be George Strait, a legend, an icon, a man who'd maintained humility and grace through 5 decades of extraordinary success. But maybe, with time and work, Richard could become someone who treated a George Strait, or a Dorothy Washington, or a Frank Mitchell, or anyone else, with the basic dignity every human deserved. That was the lesson George Strait had taught without even trying to teach it. That how you treat people when you think they can't help you reveals who you really are. And Richard Caldwell, finally, was learning to be someone he could live with. 3 months after the incident in Nashville, on a warm Texas evening, Richard Caldwell wasn't defined by a viral video or a moment of ugliness. He was defined by what he chose to do next, and the day after that, and every day following. It wasn't redemption yet, but it was a beginning. And sometimes, a beginning is all you need.